Hello friends, welcome back to TMYS Academy. I am with Brian Hatcher. He is the professor and Packard Chair of Theology in Tufts University in Massachusetts. His recent book, Hinduism Before Reform, offers in-depth comparison of the early histories of Swaminarayan Sampraday and the Brahmo Samaj. Here, a part of his hypothesis challenges Bengal Renaissance leader Raja Ram Mohan Roy's reform vision and tries to question the politics behind his motive. So as you can understand, I'm a Bengali, and somewhere this particular topic of the book has shaken me out of my chair, and I'm here with Professor Brian Hatcher to discuss this and ask him some questions about his book, his research, and also some unpleasant questions, if I may. And Professor Hatcher has been kind enough to allow me to do that. Professor Hatcher, welcome to TMYS Academy.
Thank you, Coral. It's so wonderful to be here. It's a real pleasure.
My pleasure.
I'm grateful for your attention to the book and anxious to talk a little bit about it. So,
thank you so much, and we are equally glad, and we are probably very honored to be talking to you this evening. So, Professor, the first question I wanted to ask you is, how did you decide to write Hinduism Before Reforms, and why this interest in India and Bengal, or rather, what is your personal history with this particular region?
Yeah, let me start with the second question first, and then that will take us, hopefully not too circuitously, to the first question. I'll give the short answer because there's always a long story about how one becomes interested in something. But back in the early part of my career as a graduate student, I had an interest in India. I wanted to study India. I became very interested in Hinduism, and I had a professor who drew my attention to Bengal and to the developments in 19th century Bengal in particular. Figures like Sri Ram Krishna, Swamy Vivekananda, Rabindranath Tagore. And my fascination was captured by that. So when I eventually made it to a doctoral program at Harvard, I decided I would try my first trip to India would be a chance to learn some Bangla and spend time in Bengal. So I went to Shantiniketan and spent 9 months there. It was my introduction to India, it was my introduction to Bengal, and my love of Bengal has persisted ever since. And while I was in Shantiniketan thinking I might be interested in doing research on Rabindranath Tagore, I discovered the figure of who was unknown to me. Of course, he didn't need discovering, but I had not known about the figure of Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar, the great Sanskrit pundit and social reformer. And I realized that, particularly in America, there was almost no knowledge about Vidyashagar, his career, his accomplishments, and his significance. So I thought I would write my doctoral dissertation on Vidyashagar. So I went ahead and did that. And again, from there came my first publications and books and a lot of my interest there, which in time segued into interest in the Brahmo Samaj and the Tattvabodhini Sabha and early reform in colonial Calcutta. So Ram Mohan Roy had been in the background of my mind from the very beginning. Of course, so-called father of modern India, one of the great men in India's modern history that can't be overlooked in any survey of modern Indian history. Then more latterly, it was 2013, I was invited to an international conference. It was sponsored by the BAPS Swaminarayan organization, and hosted at the Akshardham temple complex in Delhi. Mm-hmm. I was initially anxious or nervous to go, actually is the word I want to use, because I wouldn't, as a scholar, I wouldn't speak at functions that were organized and sponsored by the group that I was interested in studying, because it seems just a little too close and maybe the critical objectives would not be able to be fulfilled. But a number of my other colleagues from India and from the US were going, and they said, "Oh, you should please come." And I also said, well, I'm a Bengal person. I think of Swaminarayan tradition, and I think of Gujarat and the diaspora, and these are not things I had really worked on extensively. But my friends persisted, and they said, "You should come. You're interested in modern reform Hinduism. You'll be interested to come and speak." So I did, and that began my kind of inquiry into where we developed and acquired this habit of speaking about reform as the dominant trend in modern Hinduism. That one of the major things that seems to happen to Hinduism, post-18, that it undergoes a series of reforms. And of course, we think of Ram Mohan Roy in that context as the great reformer. But Swaminarayan, or Sahajanand Swamy, was also understood to be a reformer too. So I wanted to ask myself, well, these are very different figures. And you pointed this out yourself in email communication. They're very different figures. So how is it we call both of them reformers? And the movements that they started, the Brahmo Samaj on the one hand and the Swaminarayan Sampraday on the other, are also very different types of religious movements. What does it mean to call them both reformers? And is there a chance here to maybe step back and think about Hinduism differently? Think about the origins of reform as a trope or as a metaphor for what happens to Hinduism? And so I didn't know at the time, but there was the origin of the book. So that was 2013, and so here it is 2020, and the book is out. And so it took me several years to put it all together. So
I can understand, because it's not an easy book to write, and moreover, you were challenging some defined things. You were trying to find evidence against a few popular beliefs. So I can understand that how much of your research, you probably had to do more research than if anybody tried to write on the reform policies or the reform measures that were taken around that period.
yeah, exactly. I mean, on the one hand, I wanted deliberately to cast Rammohun in a different light, not because I was looking to tarnish his reputation or bring him down a peg or anything like that. I simply wanted to see if there was another way we could frame the significance of his life. So for me, that involved thinking of him outside of Kolkata, prior to his real arrival in Kolkata in 1815, and think about his intellectual formation around North India and Northern Bengal, and in what I call an Indo-Persianate kind of culture, in which the Darbar and the norms of Indo-Persian civility were very dominant. And of course, we can just think of Rammohun and his kaftan and his Persianate garb in the standard depictions of him, and it made me think, could we situate him outside of the, sort of prima facie Hindu view, and think of him as a kind of a ruler over a court in a sort of pre-modern context.
Yes, I mean, when we talk about figures like Ram Mohan Roy or anybody of that Renaissance period, we obviously look at them from a very idealistic point of view, and probably your attempt is to bring them out of that idealistic boundary and explore the more humanitarian aspect of their living, which is not which should not be unforgiving if they are human beings.
No,
it's
exactly.
not necessary that they have to be God.
No, and I think hopefully by the end of what I've done, I've actually revealed just another dimension of the incredible religious creativity and humanism, if you want to put it that way, of a Rammohun. But I found a different way, hopefully, to think about its significance. One of my overarching goals in the book is really, when looking at both figures, is to suggest how much our understanding of them, and this kind of connects to what you're saying, how much our understanding of them involves a series of projections back onto the past from a later period. So many of the great accounts of these, both Rammohun and Sahajanand Swamy, come from the late 19th century, when certain norms about Hinduism were already being set in place by the British Orientalists, by the missionaries, and by imperial discourse more generally. And certain assumptions about what had been wrong with Hinduism and what needed repairing or fixing or reforming were becoming dominant. And so in that projection backward, we look at Rammohun and we say he's the one who saved Hinduism from the errors of its superstitious ways or whatever, and redeemed it for its more humanistic and rational content. And then we look at Swaminarayan and we say, well, see, he in some sense perpetuated traditions of medieval Hinduism that now persist into the modern era. And so we have supposedly a pre-modern Swaminarayan movement and a modern Brahmo Samaj movement. And what I wanted to do, one of the sub-themes of the book, is to focus on what I call the early colonial period, this period from, say, 1780 to 1830, when what struck me, really what piqued my interest, was when I discovered that Sahajanand Swamy and Ram Mohan Roy were nearly exact contemporaries. They lived at precisely the same moment on either sides of the subcontinent. So I thought they deserved to be put into the same temporal framework, and then we need to find a way to compare the two. So what I realized is the early colonial period, that 1780 to 1830 period, needed to be brought out in its own right and understood without projecting onto it a number of things that we associate with colonialism in the later colonial period, which we tend to project back on the past. So there's an attempt here to rethink the origins of these two movements and thinking of them both. I don't even call them throughout the book, and I know you haven't had a chance to see the entire book, but I don't use the word movement because I'm deliberately throughout trying to think of a new way to talk about these two organizations, if you will, which I call religious polities. And that may be too much to get into here, but it's an effort at rethinking. And I'm curious you raised it in a question to me over email.
This word polity, I will catch you on that.
Okay, good.
But
we'll get there.
Before we get there, I wanted to ask you, I mean, first is the thing that you just say, that probably this reform thing that was happening in that era, probably when you bring these two think tanks together, probably it establishes that the reform was not only happening in the East through Bengal, but there was also a subtle support or a strong support from the West as well, which we didn't obviously have too much of information sharing during those times.
Right.
So they remained isolated, but then the wind had started changing from two sides of the subcontinent. Is that what you find out?
Well, in part, that's a really, really astute point. And one of the points about the book is to precisely say, it's not the case that Rammohun is more modern because he was in Kolkata, which felt the fuller impact of Western influence early. And Swaminarayan was over in Gujarat on the frontier, as it were, off in the backwaters, and he didn't feel the force of modernity. My claim is that both men are equally modern in an equally modern moment. And that actually it's wrong to think of the Swaminarayan movement arising in complete isolation. So what I tried to show is the way in which Sahajanand Swamy was very skillful in dealing with East India Company actors on the ground in Western India. He worked very skillfully with collectors and agents in Ahmedabad and Baroda and places like that to establish productive relationships that actually allowed him to fulfill his mission of establishing a new Sampraday. So I try to disabuse us, because one of the standard ways of thinking about the difference between the two movements, if you read some of the older accounts, is that what makes for modern Hinduism is the encounter with the West, of course. So the reform of Hinduism begins with the arrival of William Carey and the Serampore Baptists, and the birth of modernity happens in Bengal through Western contact. And so therefore, it looks as if a Swaminarayan couldn't be modern because he didn't have that kind of contact. But what I try to show is that both men, even if the contexts were very different, so the book entails a section that it tries to bring forward what it looked like in Gujarat in the early colonial moment, and then what it looked like in Bengal in the early colonial moment. And I don't say they're the same, they're different, but certain themes are persistent in both places, which makes us, or should, I think, encourage us to think about both figures trying to address similar kind of engagements with Western modernity, if you will.
So, the popular history is that Raja Ram Mohan Roy tried to defy religious disparities with his idea of Brahmo Samaj, which believes in one supreme being. So, do you say that this is half-truth? And if yes, what is your interpretation of that history, and how do you go about tracing the evidences in favor of your argument?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's a half-truth. I mean, I think he was a committed monotheist. I think that mattered intensely to him, and I think his commitment to monotheism made him someone who felt like a lot of the religious divisions could be boiled down to or overcome by achieving a higher understanding of what united religions at the level of deep understanding of God as the creator of the world. And I think he wanted to create an organization, which he did, the Brahmo Samaj, a society of believers in the one true God and Brahman, or ultimate reality, in this ekam evam adityam, right? That God is one only without a second. So I think that there's nothing wrong with that story, and I don't try to torpedo that. My only goal is to say, let's think about who he was in the production of this Samaj, how that Samaj originated in early colonial Calcutta, the conditions of his kind of authority over the group of people who gravitated to him, who became his followers and helped him fulfill his mission. I treat this as, again, a creation of a polity, as a kind of a court in which he's the leading figure who's centralizing the interest and creating gravitational pull of interest towards him of other people who feel the attraction of this teaching about Upanishadic, Vedantic understanding, which also meshed with the kind of certain versions of a kind of Sufistic or Islamic monotheism. And so the only thing I'm trying to do is rethink, instead of thinking of him as the kind of, I don't know, the Emerson great man, or there's a Carlyle, I guess, the great man who arises out of nowhere and just miraculously brings modernity through his own impulse. I'm trying to show him as a kind of lordly figure in an early colonial context who very skillfully creates a courtly environment in which to promulgate his new teaching. So yeah, the teaching and what you say about it, I think we can continue to think that way. I'm trying to think historically about the origins, I guess, in a different fashion.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, coming back to the point that we very briefly raised and then moved on to some other questions. Don't you think you have been very harsh in using the term reform polities in place of reform movements?
I mean, I'm concerned that some people will read it as too extreme. Yes. Do I think I've been? No, I don't. I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think it had some merit. Am I risking provocation? Probably yes. You know, you can imagine one of the first times I ran some of these arguments up the flagpole was in Kolkata in an address to a largely Bengali audience who felt they're an educated Bajralok audience who feel quite strongly about the Brahmo Samaj and the figure of Ram Mohan. So I was presenting to them my vision of Ram Mohan as an early leader of a religious polity. And of course, they were a bit resistant to that. And then at the same time, I was bringing forward the Sahajanand Swamy as someone to think about alongside of Ram Mohan. And they're also quite concerned about that because they don't really tend to think of the Sampraday and the Samaj as being at all equivalent. So they were very receptive. And, you know, one of the things that makes the book interesting, for all that it's a historically grounded book in the early colonial period, of course, it can't avoid thinking about where we are today. And even here it's quite interesting that even now, the two sides, the Swaminarayanis in Gujarat and the Brahmos in Bengal, these polarities are dissolving as the Swaminarayanis in particular are beginning to build mandirs and establish a stronger foothold in places like Kolkata, where they have a large BAPS mandir on the south side of the city. And some, I'll say quite frankly, some of my more liberal-minded, Brahmo-inspired Bengali friends are concerned by that because they think this is the intrusion of a kind of more sectarian, communalistic form of religion into a secular liberal Bengal. And so they're anxious about that. And I understand the anxieties and I understand the concerns. I raised them in the introduction that I sent to you, this concern about communalism in contemporary India. So I think what I'm trying to do, but I was unable to do in the book completely because of just issues of length, and I didn't want it to become just a kind of carry-all stuffed with too many ideas. But I'm also trying to think, is there any way in which doing this exercise with respect to the past and with respect to rethinking the origins of these two movements could help us arrive at some new ways to untangle some of the problems around religion and the modern Indian public sphere, if you will. So I don't know if I succeed in that or not, but you read the introduction, you see that I take up Martha Nussbaum's book on the crisis within. So I try to begin in the present and then drop back into the past.
Right. Sir, I will obviously pick up my copy of Hinduism Before Reforms the moment the lockdown lifts. But when I was reading the brief, the PDF introduction that you had sent me, there were times when I felt that probably your research is trying to find the more rebel Ram Mohan Roy, or who is more than modern or more than his welfare intent. There was a rebel in him which you were trying to trace out the origin of. Am I right in thinking like that, or it's an unfair assumption to make?
I don't, it's not an unfair assumption. I don't use the word rebel, I don't think. I'm prone to seeing that in certain creative individuals. I think in some sense, creativity requires a bit of bucking against the traces, right? And being a bit rebellious. So I've thought a lot about Tagore and Tagore's writings about Vidyasagar as a kind of rebel. And I think Tagore had equal respect for Rammohun and Vidyasagar, and I think in that sense, Rammohun does figure as a kind of a rebel. And so I think it's fitting to one degree, but what I'm also trying to show is the rebellion. I'm trying to get away from the notion of the heroic rebellion as something that's sui generis or idiosyncratic to one person, and to show that the way in which he thought about change, rebelling, if you will, was itself still structured by certain norms about power and social capital and entrepreneurship and innovation within an existing, in his case, Indo-Islamic kind of context. So this is where I emphasize him as a kind of, I make quite a bit out of the idea that he carries this title Raja, of course, which he wasn't technically a Raja, but he got bestowed this title, and it makes him a ruler. And of course, in some sense, what I'm trying to say, he had a ruling authority, even though he wasn't a king, and it makes no sense to think of him as a king. As a ruler and a ruling authority over a group of people, he had a way of congealing a sort of social configuration that worked towards meeting his ends. So it was a rebellious project against the norms of his family. Of course, had great trouble with his teachings and all of that. So he was a rebel, but I don't want to think of him just dropping out of the sky as something miraculous who just appears on the ground and begins rebelling. He comes from somewhere, and we can make sense of that. And so in some ways, Sahajanand Swamy, again, rebel wouldn't quite fit him, but he's doing something quite creative and innovative within the context provided to him in Gujarat when he arrives there. One of the things I do is I say both men begin their careers wandering around quite a bit. Of course, Sahajanand Swamy is originally from North India, near Ayodhya, and spends the early part of his career as a sadhu wandering around India, and only arrives in Gujarat, after many years of yogic training and travel and debate and all of that. And so then he begins setting up shop in Gujarat and sets up his movement. And I say the same thing. Rammohun wanders around North India, Northern Bengal, and then ends up in Kolkata, where he sets up his movement. So there's an interesting parallel there to explore.
So, Professor Hatcher, in the Naxal ideology, the time when Naxal movement started in Bengal, 1969, that ideology very strongly believed that the Renaissance figures were the privileged ones who were charioting their own propaganda as agents of British imperialism, and is not much different from the colonial bourgeois.
Yeah.
So does your Hinduism Before Reforms find similar evidence about Roy or that particular era?
Yeah, I think, we and believe me, I feel a great sensitivity towards that Naxal moment and the legacy and historical thinking, in part because my own cherished figure of Vidyasagar suffered the similar abuses in the Naxal period and had his head knocked off the statue in College Square in Kolkata because he was a comprador bourgeoisie. I think there's some validity to that claim, but I think what my book would try to do is to, of course, that was a particular political moment, and that was a particular kind of critique when the legacy of colonialism was still quite rich and still powerfully resonant for people, and the political injustices of the time were to the fore, and structural change was sought. So people were looking for the root causes and the places to lay the blame. And I think probably the critique may have gone too far in some sense. But my book might be used as evidence to show that no, in some sense, what made these two figures quite so successful as innovators was precisely their ability to work with power structures on the ground. Because I try not to show them as aloof from, distant from, or rebelling against an East India Company. But actually, they were making their peace with the idea that this was a new lay of the land, as it were, and there were opportunities. There were injustices and potential problems on the horizon, but they also saw opportunities in forming relationships and taking advantage of certain economic conditions or whatever it might have been. So Comprador, I don't know that they were out to necessarily feather their nests in any crass way, but they were taking advantage of what I call a scale of forms. There was a complex scale of political possibilities on the ground, and they were both trying to insert the movements they wanted to create within that scale of forms. In order to do that, they couldn't remain aloof. They had to navigate that territory. So whether a Marxist or a Naxalite, a scholar might look at what I say and then say, see, this is proof that these people were far too comfortable with the idea of British ruling power. But I think in the 2000 teens and now 20, we're at a place in post-colonial reflection where we're more inclined to think about not just nationalists versus colonizers, but the kind of complex intertwining of lives and projects that happened during the colonial period. And if we're to understand how these people navigated the ground, we need to show a little more probably subtlety than painting in too broad of strokes. Is that answering your question?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. So, I was reading the portion where you have spoken about Islamophobia. And this is my personal thought that Islamophobia perhaps became more apparent during our War of Independence, especially because two Muslim countries were formed towards the north and east, while India called itself secular. And later it raised its head, Islamophobia I'm talking about, through various historic mishaps. But the overwhelming dialogue about it can be attributed to digital media more than people's true communal fears. In your book, you have spoken about Islamophobia rising around 9/11 significantly. So how do you look at this aspect of history?
Yeah, and again, this is the part of the book in which I'm trying to stand more in the present and think about how these critical issues might arise for us today. And then that launches us into the quest to go back and think in the past. So I was working with Martha Nussbaum's book, The Crisis Within, which was her attempt to deal with the problem of communalism in India post-Godhra, post the massacre in Godhra and the aftermath of violence there. And so, yeah, Islamophobia was on her mind too. We'd had 9/11 in the US, you had Godhra, and you had Ayodhya before, and of course, all the way back to partition, as you say. So this history of communal tension is there and has been there and has been a fundamental part of the modern Indian story. But again, I guess the book is an attempt to try to contribute some lessons towards thinking, is there another way to talk about this problem, and B, can we more particularly situate these two movements in a slightly different perspective within our understanding about communalism? Because one of the things of the standard reform narrative, I believe, and the Renaissance, which you referred to, so the awakening of India is an awakening to a more liberal, open-minded notion of religion, which comes to be associated with the Brahmos. And therefore, anything that doesn't look like Brahmoism is something antithetical to what modern India should become, which is open, liberal, secular. Well, then the antithesis is the Swaminarayan movement, because it's a Sampraday, it's a guru-led devotional movement with sectarian tendencies and with a kind of ideology of bhakti devotion to an incarnate Lord, all these things that Rammohun seemed to have been opposed to. So we get a picture of a polarity that I was concerned with, that polarity and the way that polarity continues to haunt contemporary India in terms of what do we do with people who actually are informed by bhakti sensibility, because we know many ordinary Hindus do gravitate towards puja and image worship and temples and sampradayas and yogic formations that are not a part of the Brahmo picture. So is there a way in which we can think of the modern Indian story that includes both of these aspects without it being, oh, the Brahmos are good and the Swaminarayanis are bad? One is good religion, one is bad religion. Both are forms of, as I put it, early modern Hindu practice, and both carry into traditions, which, and again, the book can't go into all of this either, but through the twists and turns of colonial history, obviously they do become polarized in some sense, and they do take particular postures perhaps towards a religion like Islam. And so there is a challenge there to thinking about where, I allude to this in the book, of course, the apparent comfortableness of some of the Swaminarayan leaders with Hindutva nationalism, where they seem to have a greater ease in making peace with leaders like Yogi Adityanath or Narendra Modi, because they seem to stand for a kind of saffron version of Hinduism. And we wouldn't associate that with the Brahmo Samaj, which we associate with liberal secular rationalism. So there is a subsequent history that we have to take account of, which does lead to some uncomfortable alliances, perhaps, and the cementing of polarities. But as an exercise in perhaps thinking through, I don't know, extricating ourselves from some of the mental frameworks that we carry with us, this is what the book is dedicated to doing anyway, tries to do.
So, Professor, a school of thought says that the Western scholars have a tendency to look at Indian achievements and glories critically and defy the grandeur of the Hindu lineage with liberal pessimism. How do you respond to that?
So rephrase the question, because I just didn't catch the first part.
A school of thought says that Western scholars have a tendency to look at Indian achievements and glories critically and defy the grandeur of the Hindu lineage with liberal pessimism. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, this is a whole other aspect of the challenge of doing the kind of work that I do. As an American, non-Hindu, non-Indian scholar, I'm open to criticism for projecting an Orientalist gaze onto India or denigrating certain forms of Hinduism out of my posture of a kind of modern liberal sensibility. And this is something, as a scholar of Hinduism in the American Academy, I'm quite sensitive to. I teach courses at Tufts in which sometimes 2/3 or half of my students are heritage students or students directly from India with Hindu backgrounds and who are interested in learning about their tradition. But at the same time, there's always grumblings on campus. Oh, how does a white Videshi scholar teach about Hinduism? He has no experiential connection to Hinduism. How can he possibly know anything to teach us useful about Hinduism? So I understand there's a lot of anxiety around this and a lot of concern. And I do think, obviously, the legacy of colonialism and the Western constructions of Hinduism has not been a pretty one in terms of the way it's treated the manifest forms of Hinduism. So my answer would be the book is very much an attempt to bring more sophistication and balance to our understanding of the spectrum that is Hindu practice and Hindu belief. That we run a great risk in associating one kind of Hinduism with true Hinduism, if it means writing off others and then creating kind of hierarchies of better and worse kinds of Hinduism. So, my bigger fear at the same time, when I think of your question, is as if I go back to my friends in Bengal, they'll think I'm doing grievous harm to the figure of Ram Mohan Roy by daring to put him on the same page with the Swaminarayan. That's not the story. That's not the way we think about this. So I'm being a bit of a rebel there myself, trying to trouble the waters, I guess.
Okay, that actually, my last question comes from just where you ended, which is Indians are very possessive about their icons and about challenging popular ideals.
Yeah.
And that too from their religious history. I mean, this could have its consequences. Are you prepared for that?
I hope so. My third book I entitled Bourgeois Hinduism, and it's an investigation of the work of Debendranath Tagore, so Rabindranath's father, and the founding of the Tattva Sabha in Bengal, a movement many people don't know much about. And my argument in that book was that there was a moment in the 1830s, 40s, when the Brahmos were able to articulate a religious worldview that could be comfortable also with a worldly path of success. That is, you could have success in the world financially in terms of family, social relationships, and also gain what we think of as moksha, or liberation. You could have both, instead of the Upanishadic view that you had to kind of renounce the world and become a yogi to attain supreme enlightenment or something. And so I thought this sat well with an aspirational culture of the 1830s, when Bengalis were thinking they could do well under this new colonial regime and prosper and have success in the commercial sphere and in the public sphere generally. So I came up with this idea, we'll call it bourgeois Hinduism. And I remember my editor at the time asking me, "Are you sure you want to use that title? Because that may raise some hackles and you may get in trouble for that." And I said, "Well, I don't mean it. I'm not trying to be snarky. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to the tradition. I'm trying to name a dynamic. And so, yeah, let's try it." And in the end, there was no serious pushback on the phrase, and it's gained a certain traction as a descriptor for a certain moment and a style of Hinduism. So I'm hoping here too that, yeah, there will always be some who maybe their antennae may go up and they may feel a little hot under the collar that I've changed the terms of the narrative, but that's precisely what I'm trying to do. I mean, I think one of the things when I read colonial history and literature with my students on Hinduism is to get them to see the way in which seems as if we keep telling the same story over and over again in our school books, our textbooks, our curriculum keeps repeating it. And there comes a time when you have to ask if we're just repeating a story without really fundamentally interrogating the terms on which the story is predicated. So by pulling forward reform and trying to interrogate how that operates, I try to show it's embedded in certain Christian Protestant notions of religion. And if you pull those Christian Protestant assumptions out, then you're not able to say that one form of religion is better than the other. So it's really an attempt to, yeah, I mean, maybe some people will find it troubling, but sometimes if you want to change the game, you have to upset the cards, I guess.
Professor, I do believe that there are different aspects of history, and often all of us are very comfortable with accepting one particular way to look at history. We refuse to agree that our inspirations are human beings and can have another aspect of their outlook, which don't gel that well with our expectations from the inspiration.
Yes.
But then it is the work of a historian to point out the comfortable areas, and it is also the work of a historian to debate over the truth of that comfort. So I'm sure that your book has done that job, and I'm sure that your book will pass from hand to hand, and it will raise some discussions. It will make people think. It will make people look back, raise dialogues, make people think, and know another aspect of Ram Mohan Roy. And if we treat that person as our inspiration, we should know him in and out from different angles and expect him the way he is, and not the way we want him to be.
Yeah.
So all the best for
thank you.
The book, Hinduism Before Reforms, and I really look forward to read it. And
thank
thank you so much for being
thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. You're very generous, and your questions have been spot on. And so I look forward to carrying on a conversation. And yeah, I do hope the book it should be out in India from HarperCollins distribution soon. And so hopefully people will see it there. That was my hope. So let's see what happens.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Coral.
My dear viewers, those of you who are watching us, please keep learning. I know it's lockdown, but don't stop learning. Don't stop debating. Don't stop talking to each other. We may be socially distanced, but we are not intellectually distanced. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Be safe.